Hey folks, welcome to another Geometry Nodes tutorial. In this one, we're going to be having a little bit of a different session because we're having a look at the Looking Glass portrait. Now, for those of you who do not know, this is just the most ridiculous bit of tech that I've ever seen, and I've got one, which is nuts. So it arrived last week, and I like to think of myself as being fairly tech savvy, you know, like I've got quite a nice computer and keep up to date with like cameras and lights and things and displays. But I was not prepared for seeing this thing. Like, I followed the Kickstarter, I have a friend who's got one, and I've seen loads of pictures and videos, but when you have it in front of you and you are looking at it, it's just a little bit kind of bizarre. You just accept that it's 3D. Now, the reason I'm particularly excited about this is because there is an add-on for Blender that allows you to create content and send it directly to the Looking Glass, as well as render out content to be viewed on the Looking Glass when it is in standalone mode. So this is the great thing about the Looking Glass, is you can use it paired up to a computer where you are sending content to it directly, in which case things like using a leap motion or, you know, other hardware becomes an option. If you are using Unity, then perhaps you want to do something which is like audio reactive, do some amazing experiences through it. The Looking Glass can also be used in standalone, which is where you have loaded up videos or images to the Looking Glass. And that's an important thing. Videos or images, you can do animations and just play them in 3D like it's crazy. So that's basically what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you how to set up your Looking Glass. I'm going to show you how to install the add-on and get use out of it in Blender, get something out of Blender, and then we're going to jump into Geometry Nodes and we're going to create a little cool little thing with Geometry Nodes with some of the new nodes that have been added in the last few days. So without further ado, let's jump in. When you get your Looking Glass, the first thing you're going to need to do is make sure you have the HoloPlay Service installed on your device, and this is basically your driver to get it working as needed. This is available for Windows, Mac, Debian-based Linux, and Red Hat-based Linux, and I've been told that there is also a package going to be coming down the line at some point for Arch-based Linux, which is great because I have a Manjaro laptop, so that'll allow me to kind of take this and be a bit more portable and out of the house with it. The next thing you're going to want is the add-on, and this is available from the link down in the description. It is this one here, the AliceLG. So we're just going to grab this one directly. I'm going to grab the beta version. You can grab a stable one, but I've had no problems, no instability with the beta ones. So come in here, go up to code, download that zip, and then we can install it in Blender. And all we need to do is come in, edit, preferences, and we're just going to go ahead and install AliceLG. Here it is. Tick that box on, and you're going to need to install in here. So click this button. It's just going to download a few additional Python dependencies and install them into your Blender version. There we go. Now it's saying, please restart Blender. Okay, so we're back into Blender. And if I press N now, then we have the Looking Glass options on the right-hand side here. And this is what I was saying was important about having the HoloPlay Service installed, is that you can actually use your Looking Glass directly from Blender now. If we click this button to the right-hand side, it's going to open a new window, and we can see now on the Looking Glass that we have turned it into Blender. Very exciting. But right now, we don't have any controls or anything. First of all, I'm going to add Suzanne just so we can look at something. There we go. And we can see it's there, but it's kind of also not. We need a camera. Right now, this doesn't really have a camera to look from. So let's go ahead and just click plus on here. Now we can see we have a camera. You'll notice as I move this around, it's very laggy, and this is because every time something happens in the viewport, it's going to automatically try and update this Looking Glass. And that is a problem because every update requires 48 views at a minimum. If we just turn off our refresh mode, set it over to manual, then it means that every time we click the button, it's going to update, but the rest of the time, we're free to do as we wish. So I'm going to move it around like this, and I'm going to make it a little bit more wide angle. I'm going to come into camera view, and you can see what's going on here. We have a clipping region. That's what this box is. This box is saying where your clip start is, where your clip end is, and where your focal length is. The focal plane is this white plane in the middle, and it refers to the position that the camera rotates around. So your 48 views are laterally like spaced, right? So it's as if you're looking at it from different angles, which is correct for, you know, for viewing the display from different angles. Let's go ahead and just update this. So now we can see that we have Suzanne in the view. And as I move this around, you can see more and less. In fact, maybe if I just make a little bit more in the foreground, and I'll just add another, in fact, maybe let's just duplicate Suzanne here and just bring her forwards. So we'll be able to see on this left-hand side a little bit more accentuated what's going on. So you can see things come in and out of view behind that small one now. So you can really see that it is actually three-dimensional, and it's weird because your eyes don't really question it. You just kind of accept that it is in fact 3D. Alright, what if you want to view it in a different viewport setting? So we can come down to our shading and overlays settings at the bottom here. And right now it's just copying our active viewport. In fact, generally this is what I would say to do, but we can also go and change it to use wireframe. If I update this, then we can see we get wireframe instead. Or you could set this to the material preview mode, in which case you're going to get Eevee. Now if you want to get like rendered view, you're going to need to have it in the Blender settings, the main Blender settings. And if I jump into rendered view right now, we can't actually get cycles live. Obviously it's going to take too long to ray trace this, but if I jump over to Eevee and let's add a light in here, an area light, there we go. So we have some lighting going on, and I've got it set to the Blender active viewport. So if I refresh that, then we can see that we actually have lighting set up. If you want to hide your overlays as well, then that's going to just hide any of these. There we go. Any of those extra bits. If it's looking a little bit dark, it might be that your viewport samples are set really low. By default, I would actually have my viewport sampling set to 0, and that basically means that it will just sample infinitely in Blender, but that is a problem for the display. So when that happens, it only does a single pass, and we can see that we end up with these really sharp lines in the shadows. So just make sure that you have a few. 16 is probably fine. You can always go higher as well. And that's just going to make sure that you get a much more soft edge to your shadows. Let's render something. So we can render a quilt, and this is a grid of our images. And if I just hit render now, it will do it, but it's not going to be useful to us. What we want to do first of all is to assign somewhere for these to save. So if I come into my just general Blender output settings, I need to set somewhere for the output. So by default it's just temp, but that's not actually going to save correctly. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that I'm saving into my quilt tests. Let's just save this one as monkey. I'm always going to put an underscore just to make sure that you get a nice spacing in here as well. And now when I hit render the quilt, we can see each of these different views being rendered in turn. There's a progress bar, and then ultimately it's going to spit out an actual quilt. So if I go into my quilt viewer, so we can either switch between viewport or viewing, and this is going to allow me to open another one. So let me just grab that monkey test, and now you can see that is the proper rendered version. It got slightly lighter as well in the render. It's important to note the viewport can sometimes look a little bit dark. It's crazy that that's a 2D display, and like you can see around, you can see that ear popping in and out. It's crazy. Such a cool bit of tech. And you can do the same thing for an animation, and we'll do that a little bit later once we get into the geometry nodes as well. But I just want to show you how to actually load one of these up onto your device for standalone use. So if I just go and search for HoloPlay Studio, this is another app that you're going to need with your device, and it basically allows you to load on, here we go, here's my sunflowers, to load on additional quilts. So here's the sunflowers that I've done. If you know BBBN19, Ben's done some cool stuff. He sent me this one, which is his Batman render. Very cool. And here's an animation by Sagar Patel. And if I play this, we can see what? It's so trippy, it's so cool. But again, completely 3D, and there's sound as well with this one. Man, they're mesmerizing. But if we want to add our own, what we need to do is we need to find where we've saved it. And once you've navigated there, you can just grab your quilt. And if I look at this normally, you can see it's just a grid of images. Let's drag this in, and I'm going to load it as a quilt. And now we can see that it has been loaded correctly. It's very important to note that the file name is important, right? This QS8x6, that is important because it's basically saying the number of columns. And if you were to set this differently, see what happens when you override that. So it messes up which images it's showing you. Oh, I'm going to delete that. If you wanted these to be permanently in standalone mode, you would just click sync playlist and it's going to load them up onto your device permanently, and then you can use it without the computer. So that's very useful if, for example, you're doing exhibitions or you want to show it to clients. So let's be jumping into geometry nodes now. What I'm going to be showing you today is a technique that basically flips and grows objects. It's a really nice way of getting things to transition. I've got to take my hat off to Bradley Animation, who this is kind of inspired by. You can see that that car is flipping and each of the panels is scaling and rotating, and it's just a really nice effect. So what I'm going to be doing is this, but we're going to be doing it to this model. And this is linked down below along with Bradley's tutorial. So if you want to grab this and work along with me, be my guest. There's a really nice way of working. It makes it super easy to do this in geometry nodes. That model is very conveniently a blend file. So I can just go Control O, find my model. I'm going to press N. I'm going to turn off Load UI. I always like to use my own user interface. There we go. Now we have our model. Let's go ahead and check the textures are in. And this is going to be exactly the same for you. It's going to load without any textures. But you've just downloaded a folder with some textures. So let's go ahead and link those. External data, find missing files. Just go into that textures folder, hit find missing files. And there we go. It's loaded them all in nicely. We do have some missing windows. I'm just going to delete these. And for the sake of convenience, we're also going to be working in EV. If you think about how long it takes to render in cycles, multiply that by 48 for your minimum Quilt render. So if you render an animation that has 30 frames and each render takes 48 renders to complete the 3D view, then suddenly you're looking at an awful lot of time spent rendering. At a minimum is 1440. So it's a lot of renders it's going to do. You've got to be cognizant of that when you're making renders, and this is why I'm going to be doing this on EV. But this model still looks great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new collection. I'm going to take my ground and the sun, so these two, and I'm just going to move them into that new collection and rename it ground. And then I'm going to rename my first collection building. I want to make sure that all of this is separate geometry. Now we're going to do a little bit of additional work to split things up as well. So you'll just have to bear with me for a moment. If I go into my solid shading, if you want to mimic this with the different colors, in your viewport shading options, set to flat, random, and cavity set to both. And it just gives you this really nice feedback of what different stuff is. I'm going to turn off clickability so I can't select my floor. And now I can select individual objects up here. I'm going to select everything, tab into edit mode, select all again, press P, and then by loose parts. So now we can see that we have all of these different roof panels and even stuff like these little bits of metal on the side here. They're all individual. Now we do notice that the large parts of the building are actually single objects, and I want to split these up into individual walls. So let's go ahead and just go into the local view with the number pad, and I'm going to delete the floors. So select both, tab into edit mode. I'm in my face selection mode. I'm going to just grab these, delete faces, and there's another one, delete faces. So that's just cut it down a little bit easier. And now I'm going to select walls, P by selection. Grab this end as well, P by selection. And then this back wall I can separate off. This side here, I can separate this one. I'm going to do the same over here. I'm going to grab that floor there, delete face, and this bit of roof. And that is everything, I think. Oh, that's actually still got some bits in it. Let's separate those by selection. There we go. So that's all done nicely. Let's go back into the whole view. And now we can start looking at how we can actually do this effect. So hide your building, and just go ahead and add an object. It could be any object. I'm just going to use a plane. I'm going to press Alt G just to put it back to the center there. And let's hop over into geometry nodes. If I add a new node tree, and I can just delete my group input, and we can add a collection info node, join this up to our output, and let's select that building collection. I want to separate my children, but before I do, I want to explain why. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be rotating instances. And this is a really nice way of working now because we have all of these different instance options that are going to allow us to basically process this as individual things. The collection info node brings in every individual object in that collection as an instance. Now, right now, these are all joined together. We can separate them into individual instances as well. If I go into my instances, rotate instances, this top one is our rotation. You can now see that we have this all in here. Now everything's rotating a bit weirdly. This is because our origin positions have not been set back to the geometry. So let's hide that one, reshow our building, select all, right click, set origin to geometry. And now we can see that's a little bit better spaced. Go back to our plane, and now you can see things are rotating around themselves. Now I want to have a little bit more control here. When I rotate this in the y-axis, which is what we'll be doing, you can see most of it rotates in one direction, but you've got stuff like these walls that kind of feel like they want to be folding in the x direction instead. We can actually do this by manipulating the local transforms. So again, I'm going to hide this plane, go back to our building, and I'm going to select all of these objects that are sort of facing this axis. Right, so all of this stuff like this. You can grab these windows, maybe grab these uprights as well here. So if I just grab these away, you can see that we've selected everything that faces this axis. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate in the z-axis by 90. I'm going to apply the rotation, and I'm going to rotate in the z-axis by -90. So it's put it back, but now it has a 90-degree offset rotation locally. And this is important because when we do our rotation in the instance node, we are looking at the local space of all of these things. So we can get some really cool effects going on. Now we also want these to scale down, and we want some control. We want this to be happening with an empty. So go ahead and add an empty as well. So empty sphere, always nice to work with. And let's just drag this into our node tree like so. I'll set it to relative. And now this basically means that wherever this is, and if this is in somewhere that's not in the center, it's all still going to line up. I'm going to add an instances scale instance node. And if I change my scaling, you can see that everything just scales down to the 0 position, and that's nice. So we want it to scale to 0 and rotate at the same time. And we want this to all be controlled by the position of our empty. We also want this to be kind of linear, right? So it's not just the distance from the empty, it's like everything to the left of the empty, but with a bit of fall off in the middle. Nice easy way for us to do this is we can take our position, world position, right? So input, position. I'm going to take a vector math node, and I'm just going to subtract the location, and then I'm going to separate this. So vector, separate x, y, z, and now I have a gradient. I'm going to put this through a map range node just to give us the fall off control. So let's take our x. I want to put this, let's just plug it straight into that scale to begin with. So you can see as I come across here, things pop in. I mean, that's already quite nice. Let's have some more control here. I'm going to pin this node tree as well. So I can set the distance of that fall off. And something that may actually be a little bit more fun actually is to set the distance by this scale value. So now if I scale this up, you can see that it's having a slower effect. Or if I scale it right down, a very fast effect. Actually, let me change that add to a subtract just so it's going in the correct direction. There we go. That's a little bit more logical. And we're going to just chuck a vector rotate on here. Set this to Euler, and we're going to plug in our rotation into the rotation. Make sure it's all working correctly. It's backwards, so let's set this to invert. And now we can see that we can set this, for example, diagonally. And we get that diagonal offset instead. We can also rotate it in the x-axis, for example. Or sorry, the y-axis. And now we have it in the z. Cool, so I think this is actually what I'm going to go with. So let me just rotate y 90. And now you can see that we can bring this in or out from top to bottom. So this is a really nice and easy way of working, right? So now we've sorted out everything we want to do for our scaling. That's working nicely. We want to sort this out for our rotation as well. So let's grab our map range, and I'm also going to be throwing this through a combine XYZ just so I can only control the Y rotation. Go ahead and add a vector, combine XYZ, plug this into Y, and we'll plug this into our rotation. Bear in mind that rotation is the first socket there. Let's set our 2 max to be tau, and now everything flips over as it disappears. That's really cool. Now you could actually offset this by adding or subtracting from that X gradient just before it goes through the map range. So for example, if you wanted it to rotate and then scale, you could just subtract from that gradient. I actually want them to happen at the same time, just so it's more of like more of an effect going on. Now let's go ahead and animate this. I'm only going to do half an animation, right? So I'm only going to go from like nothing to everything being in, because then I can just reverse those frames. Because I don't want to have to render so many times, you know, I'm going to save myself a lot of headache by just rendering out as little as possible and then looping and reversing. It's a really nice easy way of working with geometry nodes. Now that we have a little bit more control over collections, it's almost like a prefab, you know, you have an object that you've made manually and you can go ahead and animate it and process it through geometry nodes, but maintain the kind of the separate objects. And it all still has its own shaders and things, as we can see here. Okay, so let's go ahead and set some animation keyframes. I'm going to set my frame rate down to 12, just to make sure that we have as much time as possible. And I'm going to set my frame end to 30. Shift left arrow is going to make sure that we have the first frame. I can then come down to the bottom where nothing is in, around here. And I'm going to press I and then fix that location. Okay, now I'm going to press shift right to go to the end frame, as we can see there. I'm just going to bring this up to the top and I'm going to press I location. So now we can see everything pops in nicely. Now I need to set up the camera. So I'm going to make sure I'm on my end frame where everything is visible, and I'm going to bring up Looking Glass. Make sure you're saving along the way here. Don't forget we're using an alpha build of Blender, a beta build of the Looking Glass add-on. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Go ahead and add that camera. I'm going to set my focal length really low. So my focal length here is going to be like 10 millimeters, super fisheye. And I'm also going to set my clip start nice and short. So now if I go into my camera view, I can make sure, there we go. I can make sure that I have everything how I want it. If you're ever rendering buildings, render from head height. Don't do these like first floor or above looks. If you want people to feel embedded in your render, render from a human height. So I'm going to look up slightly like this, and that's looking good. Now I just want to make sure that my clipping region actually covers the full building, and you can see it does not. So I'm going to set my clip end beyond the end there, go back into camera view, and let's have a look at this in the Looking Glass. Let's go ahead and click that light field view, and there we go, we have it in view. It's looking pretty neat. I always love going for those super wide angle lenses because it makes these look so much more three-dimensional. You see we're coming right from like looking down that wall to being able to see the front of it, so that's just a very cool effect. Next thing, I'm going to set this to refresh manually, and I'm going to sort out my focal position. It's actually pretty good as it is, but I might just bring it back a little bit further. Focal plane back onto that corner, and let me update this and have another look. I think that's looking really good. Now what I want to do is save again, and I'm going to sort out my output. So making sure that we have a proper location and file name for our final thing. So into my quilts, we are going to call this one Post-Apocalyptic, which is the name of this house model on Sketchfab. So Post-Apocalyptic, let's go and name that, and underscore just so I've got my separator. And then we're going to hit render animation quilt. Now remember, I am using Eevee to render this. I can do little extra things like turn on ambient occlusion or bloom, and you know, they might give us a little bit more of something to look at here. Maybe as well screen space reflection. Just set up Eevee however you want it, basically, and then when you're ready to go, hit render animation quilt. Your animation can be as long as you want, just obviously bear in mind that you have to render it. But the Looking Glass itself does not really have a limit on that, just as long as the file size fits on it. And we can see now that we're starting to work through all of these different frames, and we're going to get there. You know, it's 30 times 48, which as we said before was nearly 1500. So we're at only 3% right now. I'm going to fast forward right to the end when we've got it all done. So this is all done now, and we can see that we have 30 different images, 30 different frames. So I need to combine these into a video. To do this, I'm going to use Blender. Let me close the light view display. This is quite important. So close that preview before you do something like start a new file, because if it's running that preview when you start a new file, Blender will often crash. So I'm actually going to start a new video editing file, and I want to make sure that my canvas is the right size for these images, and these images are fairly large, these quilts, 3360 by 3360. So change your resolution to that, 3360. All right, so go ahead, Shift A, image and sequence. Let's make sure that we are selecting these in the correct order here, 1 to 30, add image strip. And let's just make sure if I roll here through the timeline, it's all working correctly. And I can just Shift D, and on the second one, let's go ahead and just reverse frames on the right hand side under video, reverse frames. And this will now go backwards through that clip. So I'm going to go to the final frame, which is going to be 60. I'm going to make sure that I'm rendering this out at maybe 15 actually would be fine. It does come up fairly quickly. Let's go down to 12. It might give us a little bit more of that kind of fun stop motion look. And again, I'm just going to be rendering this out. So I'm going to find my quilt folder. Let's call this one Post-Apocalyptic. And we're going to be doing an FFmpeg. Encoding is going to be MP4. Importantly, MP4 H.264, and let's go ahead and set this to high quality. I can turn off audio, that's fine. And then just hit Control F12 and it's going to render out your animation. I do actually like doing little things of video editing with Blender. Generally I would use Resolve, but Blender is just so snappy, so quick to do things. Okay, let's load this onto our device. I want to bring up the HoloPlay Studio. So HoloPlay Studio. You can see when I load this up, there we go ahead there. We get our sunflowers in my case because I've got that loaded in. And I'm just going to grab that new video from in here. Make sure you set your file format correctly. We are going for a quilt video and photo. And this is looking bad. So the reason this looks bad is because we have the wrong number of X and Y, because our name here is just the number of frames. It's not past the correct, in this case 8x6, which is the size of our grid out. So let's go ahead and change that to 8 and then 6. Now we can see that we've got that floor plane. If I play this, we have that video. So the cool thing about this is that it's still 3D. Now I can look at this at different angles as it comes in and goes. It's such a neat bit of tech. So we want to sync this up. If I sync this, I'm going to actually just remove this one because I know it's massive. So let me just sync this, and it's going to say syncing your computer to your looking glass portrait, and it's just going to basically play through each one, and it's going to be saving it onto the device. So now what we can do is I can turn this off and I can unplug it from the computer. So now you can see it is running completely just off the power. It's not connected to the computer anymore, and we have it so that you can select previous or next, and you can also press play or pause. So when it's pressing play, it'll just do it as like with images, it'll do 10 seconds per image, and it'll just be like a slideshow, and we can select the next one, and this can build up. We can pause the video, and then you still get all of that control to actually have like a proper look around your 3D. And it is like really odd at like how much 3D it looks. So there we have it, folks. That was the looking glass portrait. I'm going to be making more content for the looking glass portrait because it's just such an interesting piece of technology, and there's so many things that you can do with it. I'm really interested in using it for design and for architecture as sort of a bit of a design review tool, because things like VR headsets, they're great in putting you into a space, but they are awful at just being incredibly inconvenient and uncomfortable, and also they close you off to the world. They're one person at a time, whereas something like this, I can make something, and as long as you learn what works and what doesn't work, what camera views work, what view length, what kind of props, what kind of foreground and background, what lighting, all of these different things play into creating an image. And it's something that we haven't really explored before, is working on holographic images, 3D images. It's a whole medium, it's a whole new medium, and it's really exciting to have the opportunity to get into it nice and early. If you are interested in getting a looking glass portrait, then have a look at the link down in the description below. It'll give you $20 off, and yeah, you'll be able to get your own one. Get one in your own hands and get content creating for them. I think that's one of the really exciting things about a device like this is, the community is so much a part of it. The device has all of these add-ons made for them. If you want to be working in Unity or Unreal or Blender as we did today, then you can just use the plugin to send content directly to the device. So really an exciting time to be a creative. A lot of new media to work with. Hopefully this has been an interesting experience for you. In a few days, I've got 3 videos, or it might become 4, about Geometry Nodes 101 for like the new field system, just to get everybody primed up before November. Got a few more days to do it, so if you're interested in Geometry Nodes, stay tuned for those. I'll see you next time.